Good evening. This is the April edition of Operation City on the Hill. I'm your host, Robert Maynard. Tonight's edition is entitled The New Colossus. And this is a material that we're going to cover material again that we have covered before, but we're going to cover it from a different perspective. So, as you may recall from previous shows, The New Colossus is the title of a poem that was inscribed at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty. And it compared the Statue of Liberty, compared and contrasted it to the old Colossus of Rhodes. The Colossus of Rhodes was representing, in this view, the old world order of might makes right, and it was a symbol of, it was bestrawed, he had one leg on one side of the harbor, one leg on the other side of the harbor of coming into the city of Rhodes, ancient, back in Greco-Roman times. They had recently conquered, had a great military victory. And that statue, the Statue of Rhodes, was a symbol of it. And there was a poem that was written symbolizing this victory. And it was, it was classic might makes right. And the Statue of Liberty was contrasted to that. Instead of the mighty and the powerful, focusing on the mighty and the powerful, they were focusing upon the oppressed masses yearning to be free. So this was the context in which this was given to the U.S. as a gift to recognize the leading role that America played in the abolitionist movement, which in my opinion was the greatest moral revolution in world history. We finally abolished an age-old, well, not completely abolished, it's still around, but to a certain extent abolished in a great and large part of the world, the institution of slavery. Now, coming along with this, the abolitionist movement and the pressure against slavery, there was, in America at least, there was a civil war. And it took the Civil War to get rid of slavery in America. Now, whether or not it would have happened eventually, as some people argue, that's not an issue that I want to go into now. But basically, in some senses, the Civil War was like a second American Revolution. It was a war over, as a definition as to what kind of country America was to be. What does America stand for? In the original Declaration of Independence, they were talking about, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that we were a creedal nation, a nation that was based upon a creed. And we were breaking away from the old blood and soil. Nations there's a particular people in a particular place, and that defines them. And so you have these people and these people and these people, and they all have their own little fiefdoms, and in this view, that's what causes conflict and war, because you can't integrate, move from one place to another freely, because you're not you can't assimilate into that culture because you're not from that, you're not of that people and from that place. So they created an experiment in order to liberty, where the essence of what it means to be in America was the affirmation of certain truths that they referred to as self-evident. That there was human nature by virtue of the way we were created, because they believed in a creative aspect of human nature, was owed a certain dignity. So this was a certain viewpoint of what it meant to be an American. And it was not, okay, you come from a certain place and you come from a certain people, and therefore, and you have a certain, you got this blood and soil. Blood is the people, and soil is the place where they came from. And so the viewpoint that the founders had is that free exchange of people in goods and services was the key to prosperity. And so they wanted the free exchange of goods and services, and so they wanted to have a society that was, and it wasn't just an economic dream. This was the economics of it and the politics of it and the religious morality of it was all part of the same vision. We hold these truths to be self-evident. It was a glue to hold us all together. It was not only going to hold us together, but the unity and diversity that it provided would create a creative, dynamic civilization. So that was the idea. So you had some people who actually fought in the American Revolution to get rid of British colony, but they didn't buy into this viewpoint. And they were called Cavaliers, and they were the aristocratic class down in the South. And not everybody in the South followed this, so I don't want to broad brush Southern cultures. But you had a certain class of aristocrats down in the South that during the Revolution that took place in England between Cromwell and the forces of free Republican democracy and the Crown, these people were royalists. They supported the Crown. And then the up north you had the Puritans who supported Cromwell because Cromwell was Puritan, and they considered the American Revolution as the second English Revolution, as another fight for freedom against the tyranny of monarchy. So you had some people down south who were just the opposite. They had supported the royal family of England during this time, and they lost. Their side lost to Cromwell, so they came to America, and they settled. And they didn't agree with this. We hold these truths to be self-evident as the defining. They believed in the old order. A lot of them were classicists. They studied Aristotle, stuff like that. But Aristotle, for all the good in people that he did, he had also believed that some people were born to be slaves. Some people are born to rule, and some people were born to be ruled. And there was still a certain, there was universal ideas, yes, but there was still a certain, my people were born to rule, these people were born to be ruled. And that was the viewpoint that some of these aristocrats had. And they didn't believe, they were willing to join in the revolution because they wanted to, not at first they weren't, but when the English soldiers weren't discriminating against revolutionary Republicans and loyalists, they think, well, we better join in this or we're going to lose, homes and property and people. And so this is it's not a good thing. So they joined in and said they didn't expect the vision of America as a creedal nation to survive. But unfortunately for them, it did to a certain extent. I mean, it was divided and it wasn't uniform, but you had, they underestimated the staying power of the abolitionist movement. And when the abolitionist movement was growing, and it scared them. They didn't like it. And it undermined their legitimacy. And then when Lincoln came to be elected, they saw this as a sign that their side was losing. So they wrote this dissertation. This was like their Declaration of Independence. It was called Cornerstone. And this was their explanation, their manifesto when they wanted to separate. And so there was a lot of cause for separation. They were agrarian economy and they wanted free trade. The Northern was more of a manufacturing-based economy and they wanted protectionism. So they were arguing about for free trade versus protectionism, and they didn't like the heavy hand of the central government except when they wanted to enforce the fugitive slave law, but that's another issue. So they were, but one of the main issues that they were they wrote about that was the basis of their separation was the idea of the self-evident truth that all men are created equal. They believed in the natural hierarchy. Some men are born to rule and some men are born to be ruled. And they wanted to create a new order based upon, preserve the old order, I'm sorry. They wanted to oppose this new order and and so they're creating an experiment, just like the early Puritans and the Jeffersonians and the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence believed they were creating an experiment in order to liberty. These people wanted to create a new, not an experiment because it's a very old thing, but they wanted to create a preservation of the old ways. So they were going to break away. Now, I say this because I'm setting the stage for what was at stake, what it means to be American. And in the first revolution, the leaders of the revolution were what they call WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and you had a lot of them coming from Europe. And so their argument was being made by a lot of people is that, well, the American culture isn't really creedal, it comes from Europe. It's an extension of European culture. And so the ones who came here, okay, you had former slaves, or they weren't former during the abolitionist movement. You had these escaped slaves, and they were key figures in the abolitionist movement. Frederick Douglass was one of the major figures in the abolitionist movement. We're going to talk about him more later on, not tonight, but some other time. And so in order to their claim to be American, they can't claim a people and a place in terms of the old way because they didn't come from Europe. So they wanted to stake their claim based upon we hold these truths to be self-evident. And there's a whole book by, I'm trying to think of his name. Alan Keyes. He wrote a book called The Strength and Betrayal of Black America. No, Masters of the Dream, The Strength and Betrayal of Black America, and how they had stood for this vision of the American dream of we hold these truths to be self-evident and coming up out of nothing and achieving something. And so there was a great deal of pride of being masters of the dream, so to speak, among these escaped slaves. And former slaves, liberated slaves later after the Civil War. But then you had the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty is the mother of the oppressed, and she's beckoning the refuge from the teeming shores of all the world's tyrannies, and then welcoming people to come here and breathe free, yearning. So the qualification, the only qualification you're looking for is people who's yearning to breathe free, your wretched masses, your oppressed and your poor who are yearning to breathe free. It's paraphrasing it, of course. But so this was expanded, this view of the vanguard of the movement to define Americanism. Now you got these immigrants coming in, and you got this vision of what it means. And so you got Ellis Island, you got the Statue of Liberty, and you got to welcome them there, and they come to America, and they're being welcomed into America, and it's a place that they're helping to recreate what it means to be American. And some of them, at that time, history was better understood and better taught to the immigrants coming in, and so there was a certain pride in their role in what it means to be an American. And the role they played was actually pretty significant. And so much so that by the early 20th century, 1900s, there was a group that formed what is now called the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Center. It was a bunch of private organizations that came together, and they wanted to help people from oppressed nations fleeing, coming into America. And because they said, in their eyes, we see what it means to be an American, what it means to be free. So in other words, they see a recreation of this tradition of coming to America, fleeing tyranny that goes all the way back to the Pilgrims. And it's defining who we are. So they wanted to help the refugees coming into America, not simply because it's a good thing and they got a moral obligation to help the poor and stuff like that, but they had a clear vision that these people coming to America were reenacting this drama that made America what it is. And so at that time, you had this debate, and there's a discussion going on. And for a while, you had this Reconstructionist movement where you reconstruct the South, and you tried to. There was programs to help the former slaves, but that didn't last forever. And eventually, you had these Northern industrialists wanted to. Well, we want to create an industrial society that is continent-wide, and so therefore we need to take the agricultural society of the South and make it into an industrial society, and we want America as a whole to be able to compete with the European nations as an industrial power. So these were progressives because they will define progress in a certain way, and they had, a lot of them, there was a certain section of it called Taylorists, and they had graduated from, like Harvard Business School, and they had MBAs in business, and they were captains of industry, and they thought they were uniquely suited to lead and run a organized management. It was called managerial centrism, centralized authority in the hands of the best and brightest so they can manage society. And that would lead to progress, and this idea led to what is called the progressive movement. Now, eventually, you had people who, you got some who want an orderly society, and we want to overtake the Europeans as an industrial power. So we need order and we need progress. And then you had another wing of the progressive movement that were social justice scholars, scholars in the social field, and they went into the idea of, if you're going to have social justice, because you got to have a relative amount of equality if you're going to raise up. So if you're going to have this justice, otherwise you're going to have a revolution. Then you need to have, also they believe the same thing, a society run by the best and brightest, but instead of managerial expertise from Harvard Business School graduates and the kings of industry, you have these people with degrees in the social sciences, and they're going to socially engineer the ideal just society. So it really was the same thing. The Taylorists, progressives, and the social justice progressives believed in a rule by expert. And at that time, they wanted to cut off immigration because we wanted to have the best and brightest here if we're going to have the kind of society that is going to progress. And so there was an immigration restrictionist movement that was promoted by these guys, and they wanted, and interestingly enough, the period from the end of the Civil War to the early 20th century is when this really got going. They were pushing for it before then ideologically, but politically it didn't get going until the beginning of the 20th century. And you had, America came out of World War II, the Civil War, decimated. And we went into the early 20th century actually in fairly good shape. We held our own and took part in World War I. We were a rising power. And during a time where there wasn't really that much restriction on immigration, and I think late 19th century is when we had a peak period of the percent of our population that was non-native born. It was an immigrant population, and this rising percent of immigrants coming to this country, and the idea that we're going to define this country as a creedal nation, it didn't sit well with those people who wanted to define it as a certain people from a certain place, blood and soil. And it didn't sit well, as messy. You wanted people who wanted to socially engineer society. Well, you got people coming in from God knows where, and it makes a mess. And besides, they're going to screw up our economy for sure, and they're probably going to take the jobs. But statistically, this hasn't proven to be the case. In terms of patriotism, the understanding of what it means to be American, anybody who wants to go into this, I haven't got time to right now, but you email me at robmayn@comcast.net, and I will respond to you with facts, figures, and data to back up this. But if I do it now, it'll take the show with just facts, figures, and data and bore the hell out of everybody. So we're not going to do that. But you got statistics from surveys where people are asked questions that gauge their feeling about America. And the immigrants who came here have, on average, a higher incident of patriotic feelings towards America and what it means to be America. And given that they were participating in building this new experiment in ordered liberty post-Civil War, and that when they're coming here, they're met by the Declaration of Independence. And they can see that the people who were seeking freedom is really what's defining America. It's not whether they came from European stock or not. So this was a great sense of pride. I would argue now that our assimilation system is not what it once was, and I think we should spend more time on this. And the immigrants and refugees coming in here, part of our citizenship program should go into this a little bit more detail and let people give the feeling that they are helping to define what it means. Because we're having this argument. We're still having this argument today. Economically, we had a huge jump during this time, and from very devastated post-Civil War time to the early 20th century, when we're coming in to become a major power, industrial power, to compete with the European nations. And the theory of the progressives does not account for this because they didn't gain political power until the early 20th century. So this victory, and as a matter of fact, once we started doing all these nonsensical things they wanted to do, our economy started to shake. It wasn't, and I'm not saying that was the only reason, but you had this period of growth, post-Civil War up until early 20th century, and amazing growth from a devastated, war-torn nation to a nation that is challenging the world powers as an industrial power. And so this is an amazing period in American history in terms, and we had one of the highest incidents as a percentage of the population of new immigrants coming in as we've ever had in American history, outside of the founding when the early pilgrims came here, but that's another story. So that's Julian Simon, who was an economist, the late Julian Simon. He wrote a book called The Economic Consequences of Immigration, where he characterizes the economic benefits of immigration. To this day, we still have, from both the left and the right, people yakking about, they're gonna, as if the economy is a fixed pie and there's only so many jobs to go around, and if they come here, they're gonna do something to take our jobs away. That has not shown to be the case historically. On average, immigrants, as they come in here, on the average, now you can make incidental stories from situation to situation, but on average, the influx of immigration over time creates many more jobs than it takes up. So you have in the beginning, you're probably going to have a competition for jobs, but you have Fortune 500 companies are started by immigrants from backgrounds where their knowledge of engineering and things like that are not able to be used in their country, so they come here and they start these Fortune 500 companies. You got these ethnic families who start these little ethnic restaurants, mom and pop stores and stuff like that. So you got, I think it was 40% of Fortune 500 companies. This is the figure that Forbes magazine came up with. But that doesn't, so you got all of this dynamism that's going on, and then there's the consumption. And then there's the reality that immigrants play in terms of mitigating our demographic crisis of a nation. Around the world, nations are growing older and they're losing the young population, whereas America's hope for the future lies in and the fact that we can absorb more immigrants. So I believe, and sometimes I'm going to go into this, there are forces who are insisting on restriction of immigration that have been throughout American history because it doesn't fit their vision of what America is meant to be. So is America a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation of European descent, or is it a nation based upon a creed? We hold these truths to be self-evident. So therefore, people coming from Asia, from Europe, from Australia, from Africa, from Latin America, well, can be just as American as anyone else. As a matter of fact, if they cling in some ways, maybe even more so, because they don't have the claim to come from the people in place that the early settlers do. So they have to lay their claim in a creedal sense. So if you, in my view, if I look at the history, of course there are concerns, economic concerns people have. And there are cultural concerns about assimilation. And there is security concerns about the possibility of, you maybe terror. But each one of those concerns can be addressed. And actually, the facts show that the problem is not as significant as people are making it out to be, and that's a whole other story, and I would like to go into that at some time. But one of the things that we need to do, and if we really want to get a handle on the illegal immigration and be able to see who is in this country, and so therefore we don't have terrorists coming in, then people derisively talk about open borders, but no one's the proponents of more widespread immigration are not talking about open borders. We're talking about getting rid of quotas, artificial quotas that restrict people from coming in. And so let's say you have 100,000 people lining up to come in and you have 5,000 slots to get in. So you have 95,000 people who aren't going to be able to get in, and they're desperate to get in, and they see this as arbitrary. It's not just. It doesn't fit. So they don't consider the law so they're going to get around it. And in that 95,000, these are hypothetical numbers, but in that group of people who are trying to get in to skirt these artificial quotas, you're going to have a few, and statistically what I've seen, the numbers are very few. You're going to have some hiding in these groups as terrorists. So what we need to do is not open the borders so that anybody can come in, but get rid of the quotas. And then you have a process of screening for security. We don't want people coming in who pose a security. And you're going to have a lot less of them coming in if it's opposed to security if the flow of immigration is coming through normal checkpoints because you get rid of the quotas. We're not talking about just throwing the borders open. That is an excuse by those who want to limit immigration. And we talk about people, a lot of the people who are worried about these concerns, they have legitimate concerns, but they're being played upon. And some people realize this. They realize the history behind it. And that's why the argument is, a lot of people throw the term racism around because there was racism involved in past history of immigration restrictionism. And given that past history, we've got to be very careful with our facts and figures and make sure that the arguments we're making hold water, because the immigration restrictionist movement does have a racist history. That's not all there is to it, but there is that part of it. If you're not part of the white European stock, then you don't belong here. And now that doesn't mean that people today, just because you're opposing illegal immigration, that you belong to that group. But some of the people pushing this should know better. And I think if we're going to be true to what it means to be an American, then we have to have a real discussion. Are we saying that we're going to restrict people based upon, they're not culturally able to assimilate? Why? Because they're not European? or the economic argument's been proven not to be true. So let's get our facts straight, otherwise we're going to be discredited in our argument. Thank you very much and have a nice night. This has been the April edition, and we'll see you next month with something else.